Hello again. Here's a video I didn't expect to be able to make anytime soon, but I got a few inroads and everything fell into place pretty nicely. So let's talk about a riff that peels the skin right off my face every time I hear it. From the first track of one of Gyte's mini avant-garde black metal masterpieces. Here's the first riff from Democritus, Laughing. I'm going to just gush about Gyte for a second before getting into the analysis. I've been a fan since I first heard Perjurance back in 2016. I know I was a little late to the game. And I think Adam is one of the most innovative, exciting composers in metal because he has this really impressive ability to write extremely wonky, often very cerebral, calculated stuff, but make it sound both super aggressive and placidly beautiful, sometimes at the same time. It's also unreal just how much material he's put out and continues to put out, and how he seems to never sit still stylistically or compositionally. I'm a huge fan, and if this is your introduction to his stuff, you have a lot of fun exploring ahead of you. He also gives some very detailed technical liner notes about what went into some of his pieces compositionally, which gives me an easy analytical angle. I knew that if I was going to make a Gyte video, I would just take the super condensed, sometimes cryptic things he says and show exactly how it relates to the sounds. However, I've been a little bit afraid to do a video about his music because his music is microtonal. That is, it uses pitches that don't match up with the keys on a piano. And this opens a whole bunch of complications that I didn't think I was ready to get into. But I did a little more digging and I realized that I was, in fact, ready for a first pass, and therefore, henceforth, if you will and what have you, here we are. So here's the sentence he has about the riffs I'm going to talk about. I'll explain what each bit of it means part by part. Quote, Democritus Laughing opens with a 4-measure riff that accelerates by gaining an extra note each measure in a horizontal 4 to 5 to 6 to 7 ratio for a total of 22 notes. The 22 pitches played by the opening guitar were generated aleatorically by rolling a 24-sided die. The 3 other guitars play serial transformations of that pitch material. When the drums enter, the tempo ratio becomes vertical, and the 4 guitars trade tempos in that 4 to 5 to 6 to 7 ratio every time the opening theme recurs. So, first things first, rhythm. This is the more straightforward thing out of all the concepts in this paragraph. The piece starts with a version of what I call the subdivision game, which I made a video about a while ago, which is this thing where you divide the same span of time into different numbers of equally spaced parts, one after another. In Democritus Laughing, a span gets divided into 4, then 5, then 6, then 7 equal parts. 4 plus 5 plus 6 plus 7 equals 22, so that's the 22 note sequence he's talking about. The piece starts by cycling through the sequence 4 times before the drums come in, and each time the sequence starts again, another higher guitar layer is added with the same rhythms. Later, when the drums enter, we switch things up a little bit. Instead of all the guitars playing the same rhythms, they get scrambled so that all 4 types of subdivisions are always playing at the same time. There are also some spacer measures in between these polytempo measures. So overall, there's a measure of 4/4, or what I'm calling 4/4, that's simultaneously subdivided into 4, 5, 6, and 7 equal parts by the 4 different guitar tracks. Then we get a measure of 3/4, where as far as I can hear, everything is in rhythmic unison again. Then another measure of 4/4 that's simultaneously subdivided into 4, 5, 6, and 7, but now with the rolls of the guitar shifting over by 1. Then a spacer measure of 4/4, again where everything is playing in rhythmic unison again. Then another simultaneous subdivision measure with the rolls moving over by 1 again, or rotating around by 1. Then another 3/4 spacer measure, and then one more simultaneous subdivision 4/4 measure with the rolls of guitar switching one last time, so you get all 4 rotations of which guitar is playing which subdivision. And then one more spacer measure, and then 4 measures of 3/4 that are kind of like a turnaround before the whole thing starts again. That might have been one of the most obtuse paragraphs that I've read out loud on this channel. Hopefully the visuals and hearing it with the music will help explain, because I think conceptually this is actually pretty easy to get a hold of. It's just awkward to put it into words. So that's rhythm. Simple enough, and I think especially when you know what's happening, it's not actually that hard to hear. Now for pitch. Part of the reason that I realized I could actually do something analytical with this piece was that I found out that this piece, and most, if not all of Gyte's stuff, uses 24 equal divisions of the octave. That means that it uses the familiar 12 pitches of the chromatic scale, so A sharp, B, C, C sharp, etc. But then also all the quarter tones in between them. So A quarter sharp, A 3/4 sharp, B quarter sharp, C quarter sharp, C 3/4 sharp, etc. This simplifies a lot of things with notation and transcription. There are pretty well-established symbols for quarter flats and sharps, which makes my life a lot easier. It's not too hard, though it's definitely more time-consuming than transcription normally is, to fit pitches from a recording onto a 24-tone equal-tempered grid. So when he says that he generated the pitches of the opening using a 24-sided die, I assume each number corresponds to one of the 24 pitches in this tuning system. Aleatorically just means by chance, but it taps into a tradition of experimental composition with a pretty long history. Probably the most famous proponent of aleatoric composition was the American composer John Cage, who famously used the I Ching, star charts, imperfections on pieces of paper, and other sources over which he had no control to make compositional choices. The idea with aleatoric composition for Cage was part of his project of encouraging a radical openness to all sonic possibilities, which, as a kind of side note, was also part of his indeterminate scores, i.e. scores that left a lot up to the performer, and his embrace of sounds not traditionally thought of as musical. It's worth remembering, though, that aleatoric composition is by no means a complete abdication of compositional control. Even if they decide to write something using chance procedures, there are still tons of choices that composers have to make in everything from deciding how to create chance outcomes to how to interpret them, and there will always be aspects of the composition that are not left up to chance. I bring all that up just to get a little bit into one example of the worlds of references and different compositional and philosophical traditions that Gyte dips into. We've got to keep moving. Come on, let's go. So there's a supposedly randomly generated string of 22 pitches that the piece starts with. Here's that. I think it's interesting that these pitches all cluster around a pretty narrow area of pitch space, and there are a lot of repetitions of a few pitches. Of course, anything is possible in a truly random throw of the die, but in any case, I think this kind of narrow clustering works pretty well for what he does with this material. In serial composition, we would call this string of pitches a row, and serial composition is generally about using a specific string of pitches in a bunch of different ways to get variety with a normally pretty hidden sense of unity. That's kind of what happens here. We get the first version of the string of pitches alone in the low guitar at first. Then we get a second guitar up an octave playing the retrograde of this string. That just means playing the same pitches but in reverse order. Then the third guitar comes in another octave up with an inversion of the original row. Inversions are another one of the typical serial transformations, where you map pitches across an axis of inversion. To visualize this, it helps to use the clock face notation for pitches. The traditional chromatic clock face looks like this, but because we're in 24-tone equal temperament, we just add all the halfway points between the 12 chromatic pitches. Then we choose an axis of symmetry and map pitches across the clock face. Here is what we call an inversion about C, because C maps onto C and everything else maps according to these lines. Then, finally, the fourth guitar comes in yet another octave up, this time with the retrograde of the inversion. So to recap, we get an original version of the row, then the retrograde is added on top, then an inversion about C is added on top of that, and then finally the retrograde inversion is added on top of that. So it's this kind of texturally accumulative repetition scheme following that rhythmic pattern that I talked about earlier. When the drums come in, these different versions of the rows are scrambled according to the pattern I talked about before. In other words, each of these versions of the row stays in the same place in relation to the rhythmic pattern and in the same guitar layer, but they just get rearranged and stacked in a different way. The spacer measures add some new pitch material, which is almost triadic or partially triadic, but with some quarter tone inflections, which I think is a really cool effect that's both familiar and alien sounding. So that was a ton of words, but really this passage is, at a conceptual level, pretty straightforward, I think. As I've described it so far, it is pretty systematic, and it uses common serial processes and a bunch of repeating structures. If I ever teach an intro to set theory class, I'll definitely assign this as an exercise because of how straightforward the conceptual shape is and how exactly it follows a few ideas to their conclusions. But there are some things that are unusual about it. Here's a list of 3 of them. First, doing 24-tone equal temperament serialism isn't very common. There have certainly been composers doing serial things outside of equal temperament, and the theory doesn't really change at all. You just have more numbers to work with, but it definitely adds some complications. Second, I've been calling the pitch sequence a row, but traditionally a row is something that contains all possible pitches. I don't know if this is actually a hard and fast definition, but normally when you talk about a row in serial or atonal music or 12-tone music, it doesn't have any repetitions of pitches and it has one each of all the possible pitches in that tuning system. This one doesn't. Instead, it clusters around a small number of pitches, repeating a bunch, and leaving lots out. The bigger point here is that this intersection of aleatoric music and serial music is super interesting because I think they're generally kind of separate compositional philosophies and maybe even in opposition to each other. Roughly, it's the difference between leaving everything up to chance, which would be aleatoric composition, and on the other hand, rigidly controlling everything, which would be serial composition. But really, when you're just listening, aleatoric and serial composition end up often sounding the same, even if the way you arrive at that sound is pretty different. And I think this piece kind of highlights that similarity, that hidden similarity. Third, the rhythms are a little wonky. I talked about the kind of idealized version of the 4-5-6-7 pattern, but in reality, there's also this really wonky off-the-grid delay effect throughout the intro. And the tuplets aren't even quite exact. The quintuplets are always a little rushed so that the last note is longer than the others. The sextuplets tend to drag a little, etc. And all of this contributes to the overall kind of inexact, wonky, mocking, laughing character of this section. So there's even more stuff about this. I'm going to try to combine all of these things into a single analytical visualization for these first couple sections. And I apologize in advance to my future self editing this video for making this promise. In most of my videos, I start with some striking listening experience that I have and try to work backwards from there to get a handle on what might be contributing to that experience. This video has been kind of the opposite. I started with some hints about the deeper structure of some complicated music and have been kind of trying to work my way from these conceptual shapes to a musical experience. But the relation of these deeper structures to hearing and experience is interesting. I can definitely hear the rhythmic stuff that's happening. But would I notice if a bunch of the pitches changed and the row transformations weren't there anymore? Almost definitely not. I think these secret organizational structures are cool, and it's fun to look under the hood at what might have gone into creating this music, but I think it's important to keep this kind of compositional side of things separate from trying to understand what you're hearing. This kind of gets into a debate that happened in music theory in the late 90s and early 2000s about the role of hearing in music analysis, especially in set theory. The problem, as some scholars saw it, was that a certain branch of music theory, represented by the work of Alan Fort, had gotten so concerned with finding impossibly deep numeric connections and claiming that this was what counted as genuine analytical work without paying much attention to what these structures meant for how we hear things. On the other side, a group of scholars, maybe represented by Joe Dubiel, who's one of my dissertation advisors, made the argument that distinguishing between analysis and description of the music didn't really matter, and what matters instead is whether something helps us hear the music differently or describe something that we're actually hearing, as opposed to stuff that doesn't have much to do with hearing. I don't think there's any simple way to tie up this video in light of these concerns. I think there's definitely things that I learned to hear from this analysis, and there are some things that I can see on paper, but there's no chance I'm ever going to be able to hear. I'll link some stuff that you can read in the description if you're interested in going more into this, but this video is already probably way too long, and I'm going to call it a day. Please let me know in the comments if you've solved the problem of how analysis should relate to hearing. See ya.